So in today's episode, we discuss the future of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. We also discuss how to facilitate conversations, trends, strategies, and challenges for businesses. Let's make a social impact. Hi everyone, I'm Carl. Welcome to the Social Impact Show, where CSR professionals get the latest strategies and tips to help them grow and scale their CSR and goodness programs. Now remember, if this is your first time on this channel and you want to get the latest strategies from the experts, hit the subscription button below, hit the little notification bell so you don't miss anything. So today we got two special guests. Our first guest is Janelle St. Omer, who is our guest host today. She is the Regional Vice President with Benevity. And we also have Jerome Tennille, who is the Manager of Social Impact and Volunteerism with Marriott International.
Thank you, Carl. And we are back with Jerome. So thrilled to have you here once again. For those of you who don't know Jerome, he is a disruptor in the social impact space. He's an influencer and just an awesome, awesome person to know. So today we're going to tackle DE&I. I feel like DE&I is having such a moment in our space. And Jerome, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think is the future of DE&I in the workplace?
Well, I think we're seeing it, and what I mean by that is very similar to how there was an acceleration of CSR practices because of COVID-19. We've seen the accelerated and more renewed focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice. Right? These are all more widely utilized terms now, but we're seeing a greater focus on that because of the string of deaths that we've seen, especially in the Black community, at the hands of law enforcement. And I think the one organization or the one instance of that I think most people recognize is the death of George Floyd. And so I think what we're seeing now is the future of DEI. And I'm going to use a couple different examples. So last year, it was about this time of year, actually, that even while companies were doing mass layoffs all across the globe, they were still hiring, in many instances, DEI professionals to support the work that they're doing towards their commitments, to combat, racial injustice. And so that is still persistent. You can't go on to any job hiring site, LinkedIn, Indeed, and not see a diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging position. So I think we're seeing the future play out, and that future is people having a more deeply invested commitment to supporting communities of color and also other minority communities.
So Jerome, DE&I work has been around in the workplace for a number of years. I feel like it, in some cases goes back 20 and 30 years where we really started to have the conversation. Why do you think that it's having such a moment right now? Why do you think that deep commitment is really showing up right now in the workplace?
I think because the cost of not addressing it is being seen, and it's seeing more often and more often now. If you look back through history, like these have been issues for centuries for many nations, even prior to our founding. And specifically, I'm in the United States. So these issues they've existed for a long time, and they've certainly existed here in America for the last 300 years. But I think the prevalence of social media, body-worn cameras, just being able to have my cell phone on me and take video and audio, it has given people more outlet to see the things essentially that you may have not seen in the 80s or the 90s. And so people are, I think, they're not able to bury their head in the sand anymore. It's there, it's in your face. And if you don't address it, then you're essentially making your own bed.
That's a really good point. I think that it was easy to look away before, and now it's not. And I think technology has changed for so much of how we live our lives generally. And I think it's really helped in this area to advance these conversations. But one of the other things that I've observed over the last year in conversations with folks and such is the openness to conversation, to dialogue in the workplace in a way that it was never had before. So companies really tackling very difficult conversations internally and creating the space for those conversations to be had, however uncomfortable. How do we facilitate those conversations for companies who, are challenged? Maybe there's a practitioner who thinks they want to do it. What advice do you have to someone on how to facilitate those difficult conversations in the workplace?
So the first thing I ever share with anybody is like, for these journeys are long. You never have to do it alone, right? Like most journeys that most companies take, they don't have to do it alone. And so what I mean by that is a company that does feel ill-equipped, doesn't feel like they're in a good position to even start these conversations. There are many practitioners, consultants, there are many community-based organizations that like focus on this every single day, like 24/7. You can connect with a third party. They can be a vendor or they can be a community-based organization, and you can have that journey together. And through that journey, you can begin to facilitate or create the mechanisms that allow for safe spaces to then have the conversation. I don't think that you want to just have a conversation to have a conversation, and you really have to be careful in how these conversations are started. For companies that are on the infancy of that spectrum, they should hire an expert. I mean, let's not fake it until we make it. In this instance, hire an expert. You can do that. You don't have to do this alone. Secondly, I think leadership, they have to be 100% committed to this, and in doing so, they can give permission for others to be a part of this by putting their own neck on the line, having stake in it. They can start those conversations with other leaders, and they can make them 100% transparent, live, recorded, for other associates to see. That'll give junior and mid-level associates that permission to say, you know what, my leaders are not just committed to doing this and having these conversations, but they're having them themselves. And then eventually, once you get that foundation of conversation started amongst leadership and the real commitment and buy-in, work to figure out how you cascade that down to your mid-level management and your every level of associates, in a way that maybe you're leaning a little bit harder on your ERGs, your employee readiness groups, or maybe you are working with associates who might be entry level or mid level, and you're working with a facilitator to create that safe space for people to have conversation, but conversation that allows disagreement and allow for people to be wrong, because that's how you educate people. And so that's the suggestion that I would take, and also understand that this is not going to be like, okay, it's 2022, now we're done. This has to be regular, consistent, and it's the long haul, baby.
I agree with so many of those points. I think the first one being on engaging your leadership and really having that deep and meaningful commitment and buy-in. I think that that's so key. And it's actually really interesting if you think of the contrast in CSR, because historically, so many company, employee giving or volunteering programs were top down. And we kind of moved away from that model. And we're like, let's let the grassroots empower the employees to let that shine. But I do feel like when we're talking about DE&I, knowing how difficult it can be and the impact of the work, you have to have that buy-in from the top and be willing to have the conversation, challenging, individual biases and organizational biases, at that level to really facilitate that meaningful dialogue and the commitment to change. And the other thing I think that you said that was really powerful, and we saw it at Benevity as well, is engaging those experts to help and facilitate those conversations. But I think that what's most important about conversations in the workplace is the ripple effect that they can have. Mm-hmm. We've seen it firsthand again, at Benevity with employees who engage in these conversations, then talking about how they went home to have these conversations with their family and friends, and were able to kind of stand in their own power and tackle microaggressions that they've heard, over the years growing up, and say, no, that's not okay, to their loved ones. So when you think of the impact that the workplace can have on individuals, and those individuals then taking those feelings back into their everyday lives, to me, that's where real change can actually start to happen as well. So when you think about, some of the strategies and the tactics overall for organizations, what are some of the ones that you recommend the most to promote diversity and inclusion in the workplace?
To approach it holistically. And then also at the individual level. And what I mean by that is, I think too oftentimes DEI is siloed. And what I mean is DEI is sometimes considered its own business unit, but then it's separate, or it lives within human resources, but it might be separate from internal communications, might be separate from media relations, might be separate from marketing, might be separate from operations or manufacturing, might be separate from the business unit that manages storefronts versus corporate. And so in order to do this effectively, you have to integrate DEI and those practices holistically through all the different business units. So for example, as you're creating your marketing campaign around a new product, you're being sensitive in how you're talking about it, how you brand it, how you name it, the image that you use, right? But thinking about that you're applying that DEI lens at the onset or the inception of creativity before you're even actually making something, right? But applying it for every type of job and position, right? So it's not enough that I work with community-based organizations. I also have to apply that in my daily work. How I'm writing a social post, how I'm writing an internal communique to associates about a volunteer project, how I'm communicating to that organization when we're planning this project, right? So applying those lenses at the individual level, but then of course that requires that individuals are working on these on themselves essentially, right? You're at the individual level. If you're not working to remove your own blind spots and biases and preconceived ideas and perspectives and everything else, then all those blind spots and biases will show up in the product that you create.
I agree. And I think the one key takeaway I have from all of that is the lens, because it's the lens through which we look at every single thing that we do as a company. Mm-hmm. So I think that when companies are really thinking about where to start, if you were to take all of the things that you currently do, but just start to apply that DE&I lens to it, how does our mantra, how do our company's sort of pillars and, our purpose practices, our hiring practices, our promotion practices, if you were to take that inclusion lens to everything, how would your company look different?
So Jerome, there's one comment you made a little earlier where you're talking about this is the long term, and you've just put it all together in terms of we have to do it in terms of the lens. We have to do it whenever we create a new product, a new campaign. But I've worked in organizations in the past that exactly how you said, right? There is DE&I could be the flavor of the year, flavor of the month. The focus is on that. And then once it no longer is in the news, or it's no longer, I guess people deem it as, the key point of the month or the day, then they move on to something else. Are there any strategies you also see to make sure to keep it in the long term, in addition to, I guess, integrating it entirely into the business?
Yeah. And this is not an answer that I think most people want to hear, but I'm not going to share what people want to hear. I'm going to share what the situation, the actual, matter, the situation is. What is not a popular tactic, but I would certainly encourage, is working with a third-party community-based organization that has its own code of conduct that you have to sign on to. And that is not a common thing for companies to do. There are a lot of companies who say, we will hold ourselves accountable. We're not going to have somebody else do it. Well, what happens in many cases where companies, they claim and then don't do. A third-party community-based organization that has its own external code of conduct that you have to sign on to, it provides that checks and balance. So not only is it a community-based partner that might have really good programming that is working to rid the earth of these critical issues that we're all working to solve, but in addition to all of that, they're also there to hold you accountable as a company. And so you might lose your ability to be a part of this coalition if you fail to meet their requirements. And the requirement is oftentimes just operate more responsibly. But if you fail to meet those specific requirements that you signed on to as a company, that's a big deal. That would be like a country losing favoritism and being pushed out of United Union or the European Union. I apologize, or a country being pushed out of NATO involuntarily because they couldn't meet that specific commitment. But that's not a tactic that many companies want to take, because there is that external public-facing transparency and accountability by a third-party organization that is, oh, by the way, an expert in whatever that code of conduct is.
So sort of like the Paris Agreement, right? Where different countries sign on, and then if a country can't meet the certain targets, then the country can't meet it. But I think there is a negative connotation, or there's going to be pressure from other countries. Why can't you meet it? What can we do to help you out?
Correct. And what's even better is most of these third-party community-based organizations, they will help you meet whatever that is. Oftentimes, you set the goals that you then commit to, in partnership, and you say, okay, I can do that. As a company, you just better be realistic about what you sign on to.
So one final question here. So in addition to, making certain topics, especially D&I, like the flavor of the month, what are some of the other traps that businesses find themselves in with diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think we talked about some of it, and it's it's either the inability, lack of capability, or the lack of will that essentially creates a barrier to implementing that DEI lens more holistically through the company, right? I think that is that's a trap that I think most companies find themselves, because removing those barriers, it's hard work, and it requires money, and it also requires reorging certain administrative and operational parts of the business that may have uniquely made the business successful, right? But then the other thing that I would say is the trap, or a trap, something that somebody can work to avoid, is not including volunteer engagement as one of the tools that really essentially support and empower your employees to becoming more inclusive, becoming more empathetic, becoming more humanized through the volunteer work that they're doing. And so I think that's a trap that most companies fall into, because they say volunteering over here, DEI work focused on the associates over here, and they don't see the overlap, when I think there is a lot of overlap, where volunteer engagement as an action can actually make your employees more empathetic, more inclusive, which creates a more diverse environment.
And remember, if you're getting value from this video, we'd appreciate you hitting that like button. So the question of the day for you is, where do you see diversity, equity, inclusion moving towards in the future? And how has it impacted your business? Let us know in the comment section below. So Jerome, if our audience wants to get in touch with you or read some of your work, where can they reach you?
They can go to my website, jerometennille.com.
So if you want to listen to our previous conversation about disruptions in the corporate social responsibility space, you got to check out this video here, as well as this video for our next conversation on community investment. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in our next episode.